Let's shift gears a little. We've been talking a lot about major depression and dysthymia. Let's talk about the various theories that have been offered and the evidence for them for depressive disorders. Let's start with psychodynamic view. Freud, of course, was interested in many disorders, including depression. And one of the things that impressed him was how similar depression and grief was. If someone close to us dies, we feel an enormous amount of grief, and we label it grief rather than depression. But the feelings are remarkably similar to depression, and the behaviors that accompany them are remarkably similar to depression. So Freud speculated that depression represented a grief response to a loss. It's a good theory. Problem is, there's not always a loss, or at least we can't find one. So Freud speculated that if we can't find a loss, it's probably there and it's symbolic. Now, that sort of fixes the theory, but it's really bad science, because in science you have to be able to disprove the theory. So Freud says that we have a grief response, that is depression, but if we can't find a reason for the grief response, we're just going to assume it's there. So we can't disprove the theory. Frankly, this model has not had a lot of impact on our understanding of depression. But other people who have a psychodynamic persuasion have had an impact. Bowlby, in particular, studied infants in orphanages. Now, orphanages were very common in our country at one point. They are not now. They are common in other countries. But in our country, if there's a child available for adoption, chances are that child will be very quickly adopted. There are more couples interested in adopting than there are available children out there. This picture is from an early orphanage. What you can see is the beds are right next to one another, just enough space for the care worker to go and take care of the baby, well, these are toddlers, to feed them, to change their diapers, etc. A typical unit back in the 1940s, when Bowlby was studying this, 40s and 50s, would have 50 toddlers and 2 staff on the days and evenings and 1 staff at night. When you have 2 people taking care of 50 babies, there's barely enough time to feed them and change their diapers. There's no time to play with them. So these babies suffer a social loss. They don't have the kind of attachment that normal babies develop to their caregivers because they don't have enough contact with the caregivers. And as Bowlby discovered, these individuals are at greater risk for depression when they grow up. The behavioral perspective focuses on what people with depression do and how that behavior affects them. One of the most dramatic things that people with depression do is they withdraw from other people. Now, they withdraw because it takes a lot of energy to deal with a lot of people, and they just don't have the energy to do it, and they're not getting much out of it. But by withdrawing, they don't get anything. They don't get the social support you get from relationships, and they lose out on a lot of enjoyable things. And in fact, it isn't just withdrawal from people, but it's also withdrawal from the things that to them in the past had been enjoyable. Now, they withdraw from the things that were enjoyable because they're not enjoyable anymore. It just makes them feel bad that they aren't enjoying them. But they get no opportunity to enjoy it by not doing it at all. In fact, in the behavioral perspective, what happens is you get depressed and you withdraw. And that tends to make you more alone and no reason to not be depressed. So you get more depressed, so you withdraw more. So you get more depressed and you withdraw more. It's a vicious cycle that has you spiraling down, which is what most people with depression describe a major depressive episode, into what feels like a black hole. The cognitive perspective is similar in the sense that it talks about this spiraling down into depression, based not so much on what you do, but how you think. Now, the problem is there are actually several different cognitive views. I'm going to describe several, not all of them, but several of them lightly. The traditional view focuses on the negative thinking characteristic of individuals with depression. They tend to see themselves as a loser if they ever make mistakes. You got to be perfect or you're a loser. Now that's, first of all, not accurate thinking. It's not logical thinking. But more importantly, it's negative thinking. But it's the way they look at the world. The way you look at the world, they're called schemas. It's how you organize the world. And these kind of maladaptive, negative schemas tend to develop early in life. And they're remarkably stable. So some people may be prone to depression because of these schemas. A second cognitive perspective is called the cognitive triad. Here you have a pessimistic view of yourself and what you're capable of the world around you, and in particular about your future in that world. So 3 areas of pessimism that drive a sense that there's no hope for you. A third view just focuses on the illogic of much of what people experience when they're depressed. You make a mistake. And if you're depressive or very depressed, that mistake is proof that you're a loser, that you can't do anything right. Now think about that. You made a mistake, but the previous 20 things you did, you got right. And then you made a mistake. One way of looking at that is simply saying, well, no one's perfect. That, of course, is true. That is logical. But you got 19 or 20 things right in a row, and then you made one mistake, and you're saying, I can't do anything right. Well, that's crazy. It's so illogical. But it's typical in depression. Now, because none of us get things right, all we got to do is have an occasional mistake if you tend to be an individual who gets depressed easily, to prove to yourself that, well, you deserve to be depressed. That in fact, you really can't do anything correctly. A particularly interesting cognitive view actually started out not as a cognitive view, but as a more biologically based view. It was developed by Marty Seligman, who went on later to become the president of the American Psychological Association. And he's currently best known for his views on positive psychology, the emphasis on optimism as a way to stay emotionally healthy. Seligman started out as an experimental psychologist. Experimental psychologists usually work with animal models, typically under behavioral situations to see what the effects of certain situations are. And he discovered something very interesting called learned helplessness. Let me explain it by describing the study. What he would do is put an animal in a situation that was uncomfortable, aversive. Might have been a mild electric shock or a loud noise. The animal wanted to escape, but there was no escape. So the animal would try for a brief period of time to realize there is no escape, and would essentially kind of hunker down and get through it somehow. Okay, that makes sense. But the interesting part is what happens 2 days later. You bring the animal into a similar situation where escape from an aversive stimulus is very easy. And you create an aversive situation just like you did 2 days earlier, but the animal doesn't escape. Now, if the animal hadn't experienced the inescapable aversive situation of 2 days earlier, the animal easily escapes. So it isn't that they don't know how, but they seem to have learned to not even try. That's why he called it a learned helplessness. What impressed him is that many of the animals sort of looked like they were depressed because they couldn't get out of the situation, even though they could. It was a perfectly escapable situation. Intrigued by that, he retrained and became a clinical psychologist, licensed in the state of Pennsylvania to do therapy with clients. But mostly he wanted to do research on this learned helplessness. In animals, almost every animal placed in the situation I just described developed learned helplessness. But in human beings, some did and some did not. And he found out that it was the way people thought that made the difference in terms of whether they developed learned helplessness or not. Specifically, the thoughts that were important were called attributions. When something happens, let's say we fail at something, we try to figure out why we failed, what we can attribute the failure to. Now, there are a lot of different attributions we can make. We can think, for example, that the failure was us. We didn't do it well enough. That's an internal attribution. Or we can make an external attribution. It was someone else's fault. We can make an attribution that is stable. Okay, this happens all the time. It's going to happen. And we can also make an attribution that is either very specific. Okay, I did badly at this, and I'm not very good at that, but I do most things well. Or general. I did badly at this because, well, I do badly at everything. People who make internal, stable, and global or general attributions are prone to depression when they're faced with adverse events. And adverse events are ubiquitous. They happen to us every day. It's just the nature of life. It's a tough world that we live in. By the way, there's a phenomenon that you're probably very familiar with. I'll bet all of you know at least one person who is never responsible for things getting screwed up. It's never, ever their fault. It's always someone else. They're kind of obnoxious to be around. They'll blame everyone but themselves. You know, the good side is they're not likely to get depressed because they don't make internal attributions. The bad side is they're never going to get any better because the only people who get better are the ones who look at their contribution and try to minimize that contribution by changing things. If you're not making internal attributions, you'll never do that. I mentioned the cognitive triad. This is just a visual representation. Negative or pessimistic views, not only of yourself, but the world, and particularly the hope for the future. With that kind of pessimism, there's a hopelessness that seems to trigger depression in people. What about cultural factors that influence depression? First of all, depression is universal. Every culture we've ever studied has depression. And the rates of depression are not dramatically different across cultures. Family seems to be relevant in terms of depression, partly because family represents one of our major sources of support, but also one of our major sources of conflict. Conflict and the stress associated with it makes everything worse. And social support makes everything better. Now, they don't cause or prevent disorders, but they influence disorders. So family and how good that family is for your mental health can make a big difference. Conflict is clearly associated with depression. Some people have argued that it's part of the causal chain for depression. Others have argued that it may very well be one of the results of depression. Either way, it's certainly associated with depression. And support, whether it comes from the family or friends or your community in general, certainly makes a difference in your likelihood of developing depression and also how quickly you come out of a depression. Now, although depression is common, responses to depression, such as suicide, vary dramatically. I'm going to talk about that later on. Some cultures have very high rates of depression, other cultures very low rates of depression. One of the most interesting cultural issues in depression is something I mentioned briefly earlier. Women, which represents a subculture, are twice as likely to develop depression as men. Again, a subset of our culture. Okay, men and women live in the same culture, but their experiences are different. The question is, why is that the case? We'll talk about it a little later on. There's a lot of speculation about it. But I want to give you an interesting fact that's sort of a clue, something to think about. Depression doesn't occur in young children that often. So 10-year-olds do get depressed, but not very often. When 10-year-olds get depressed, the rate of depression in boys is the same as the rate of depression in girls. But by 16, girls are twice as likely to develop major depression as boys. So somewhere between 10 and 16, something dramatic happens. Now, if you think about it, lots of dramatic things happen between 10 and 16. Puberty, for example, and dramatic changes in our social environment. Which of those are involved? We don't know. That's a nice clue. This is a very interesting graph. This shows a number of countries and the rate of depression for men and women. And the numbers have been standardized so that the rate for men is set at 1. So the rate of depression in women is the number of cases of depression relative to men. And one of the things you're going to notice is that in just about all cases are right around 2 to 1, with one exception. In China, women are only slightly, 20% more likely to develop depression than men. That's another clue that should help us to figure out what might be going on. I'm going to finish this section by focusing on some theoretical puzzles. I mentioned that both the behavioral and the cognitive perspectives talk about depression leading to behaviors or thoughts that tend to make you more depressed, which lead to more of these behaviors or thoughts and more depressed, etc. It's sort of a vicious cycle that leads you into a deep, dark depression. These models predict unambiguously that depression should just keep getting worse and worse and worse until you don't function at all. But depression doesn't. It's self-limiting. It's almost unheard of for a depressive episode to last more than a year. And usually it's closer to half that time, with or without treatment. The people get better. So something's missing from those models because it doesn't explain why depression doesn't keep going. You also know that genes contribute and that the rate of depression is high. But to the extent that genes contribute, and people who are depressed are less likely to be involved in things like sexual behavior that would pass on their genes, you would expect that the rate of depression would be dropping. There's no evidence that that's been happening. So the question is, are there compensatory things that are making individuals with prone to depression better able to survive and pass on their genes? And then going back to Freud's speculation, Freud was right. Grief really does look a lot like depression. It doesn't always feel like depression. Because in grief, we know why we feel bad. And in depression, sometimes we know, sometimes we don't. We still need to figure out what it is that makes grief different from depression. There may very well be subgroups of depression that are grief related, in that there's a loss, and others that are not. Okay, I'm going to shift my attention to treatment here. First of all, with respect to major depression, very few people get any treatment at all. Many of them don't even recognize. They just feel bad. They just don't have any energy. They don't even label it as depression. Most of the people who do get treatment, what they get are medications that are prescribed by their general practitioner. They never see a therapist. They never see a psychiatrist. And those medications often work. We'll talk about them in just a moment. But they never get various forms of psychotherapy, which I'll also describe in just a moment. As you will see, there are a wide range of therapies that are effective in treating depression. Now, effective doesn't mean they work in every situation. Effective means they tend to work, for some people at least. Biologically, medications are by far the most common, but we will also talk about shock therapy or electroconvulsive therapy and transcranial magnetic stimulation, both of which are biological therapies, and we'll talk a little bit about how they might work. We'll also talk about several psychological therapies, some more effective than others. By far, the most widely used treatment for depression is drug therapies. And there are three classes of drugs: MAO inhibitors, tricyclics, and selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. We'll talk about each of these. MAO inhibitors were the first antidepressant, and they work reasonably well. What they do is they block the breakdown of norepinephrine and serotonin. Remember, those were the two neurotransmitters that seem to be most powerfully involved in major depression. You're probably wondering why there's a picture there of a guy eating a piece of pizza. If you are on MAO inhibitors and you eat that piece of pizza, you might very well die. One of the problems with MAO inhibitors is they have dramatic and lethal interactions with several types of food, including cheese. So you have to be very careful when you're on MAO inhibitors, what you eat and what you drink. We still use MAO inhibitors, not a lot. We are more likely to use them to treat a depressive episode in someone who is bipolar. Again, we'll be talking about bipolar disorder in just a few minutes. Bipolar individuals have depressive episodes and manic episodes. If you use MAO inhibitors on depressive episodes in a bipolar patient, you tend not to push them into a manic state. Other antidepressants often will push them into a manic state, and it's more difficult to control a manic state in bipolar disorder than a depressive state. Tricyclic antidepressants have been around for quite a while, and they're still used, and there are almost a dozen of them available. They're called tricyclics because of their chemical structure. If you've taken organic chemistry, you will probably recognize that chemical structure shown here. You have 3 carbon rings that are connected, tricycles, tricircles, 3 circles, with some other molecules that are hanging off of the middle ring. Now, there are several different patterns of molecules. Each represents a different drug. The interesting thing is that a given drug might work for a given patient, but not for another patient. So if one of these doesn't work, you can try another, and often it will work. They've been largely replaced by the SSRIs, not because the SSRIs are more effective, because they're not. But the SSRIs have fewer side effects and therefore can be tolerated. Tricyclics work by blocking the reuptake of norepinephrine and serotonin. We talked about this very early in the course, but my guess is you probably don't remember that, so let me refresh your memory. When a cell fires and the signal travels down the axon to the axon terminal, it triggers the release of neurotransmitters, these chemicals that float in the synapse, that blank space between a dendrite of one cell and the axon terminal of another cell. And those chemicals may or may not find appropriate receptors. Receptors are other chemicals that are oriented in such a way that they will bind with the chemicals. If they do find a receptor and they bind, they will trigger the next cell to be either more or less likely to fire, depending upon the nature of the neurotransmitters. Now, neurotransmitters are just complex chemicals, but they take a lot of energy to produce. So you don't want to just use them once and throw them away. So what happens is the neurotransmitters are released, and shortly thereafter they're pulled back into the cell that released them. That's called reuptake. It's basically recycling the chemicals so that they can be used hundreds, thousands, even millions of times before they finally break down. If you block that reuptake, even for a short period of time, you will allow the chemicals to be in the synapse longer, and therefore a higher probability that their random motions will help them to find a suitable bond so that they can stimulate the next cell. Now, we know for a fact that once you take a tricyclic medication, this effect on reuptake occurs very quickly, in a matter of an hour or even less. But if you take a tricyclic medication and you're depressed, you're not going to see any effect at all, even if it's going to work, for about 3 weeks on average. So what's going on? It isn't blocking the reuptake that seems to be the treatment effect, because that happens immediately, and yet there's no effect for a long time. What we believe, and there's actually pretty good evidence for that, is the change in the density of these chemicals in the synapse because of the blocking of reuptake leads to a change in the dendrite of the next cell. And that change is called downregulation, and that downregulation takes 2 to 3 weeks to occur, which is why there's a delay. That seems also to be true for the SSRIs, which we'll talk about now.